The history of rail travel is one of the clearest stories in industrial development. Demand grew. Infrastructure followed. Cities built stations as ridership expanded. The timeline is logical, well-documented, and taught in virtually every history of modern transportation. And for most of the 19th century, that explanation holds. Until you start measuring. The earliest passenger railways carried hundreds of travelers per day. In some cases, fewer. Rolling stock was limited, schedules were thin, and the concept of mass rail travel was, by almost every account, still theoretical. Engineers were solving basic problems: track gauge, steam pressure, brake reliability. The infrastructure that served early passengers was reasonably modest, functional, scaled to early need. And then you look at the stations. Not the stations built in 1890, after 3 decades of rail growth. Not the stations expanded in the early 20th century to meet industrialized demand. The stations built at, or very near, the beginning. The stations that, by any logical infrastructure timeline, should have been modest, provisional, experimental. They are not modest. This video explores historical interpretations and unanswered questions found in existing records. It does not present definitive conclusions. Consider what early rail stations were functionally required to do. They needed to shelter a small number of waiting passengers. They needed a ticketing window, perhaps a small office for station management, and a covered platform to allow boarding. Early trains were short. Early schedules ran perhaps 2 or 3 departures per day. The operational complexity was minimal by any later standard. A modest covered structure, something between a large coach stop and a small customs house, would have been entirely sufficient for the actual demand those stations faced in their opening years. What was built instead, in multiple locations across Europe, was something categorically different in scale. Grand halls. Vaulted ceilings rising 12, 15, sometimes 20 meters. Stone facades hundreds of meters in length. Internal concourses designed to process thousands of simultaneous passengers. Platforms built long enough to accommodate train lengths that would not exist for another 30 or 40 years. Waiting rooms of such proportion that the actual travelers of the era would have occupied perhaps 10 or 15% of the available floor space. Historians have noted this. The standard explanation is forward planning, that civic leaders, railway investors, and architects anticipated growth and built ambitiously ahead of demand. This is a reasonable interpretation. It has been applied consistently. It is, in many cases, almost certainly accurate. But the scale of the anticipation is worth pausing on. Building slightly ahead of demand is rational infrastructure planning. Building decades ahead, at enormous material cost with construction techniques that strain the limits of contemporary engineering, is something that invites a different kind of examination. Not suspicion. Examination. The iron and stone required for these early stations was not cheap. Labor was expensive. Engineering complexity added cost at every stage. Railway companies in the 1830s and 1840s were, in many cases, operating under significant financial pressure. Investors wanted returns. Boards demanded efficiency. And yet, repeatedly, the stations that emerged from this period of financial constraint were not economical structures. They were monumental ones. There is a specific pattern here that recurs enough to notice. The station is built. The ridership arrives, but slowly, incrementally over years. The grand hall that should, in theory, have been premature, ends up filling. Eventually it becomes proportionate, then crowded, then, in some cases, insufficient. Which means the foresight, if that is what it was accurate. Sometimes uncannily accurate. Historians point to this as evidence of visionary planning. And perhaps that is exactly what it was. Visionary planners, confident in a technology they had only just invented, constructing infrastructure calibrated not for the present but for a future they could not yet observe. But there is a tension in that reading. Visionary planning is documented. It leaves records. Letters between architects and railway boards. Arguments over budgets. Justifications to investors explaining why a larger structure was the prudent long-term investment. For some stations, this documentation exists and the forward planning narrative is well supported. For others, the documentary trail is thinner. The scale is present. The ambition is visible in the stone. But the recorded deliberation, the moment someone decided to build a hall for 10,000 daily passengers before 100 were traveling, is, in certain cases, harder to locate than the scale of the decision would suggest. That absence is not evidence of anything. Incomplete records are common across this entire period. But the combination, monumental scale, minimal supporting documentation, ridership that would not justify the structure for decades, appears in enough locations that it constitutes a pattern worth tracing carefully. Step back and consider the broader infrastructure picture of the same period. Rail stations were not the only structures of this era that appear, in retrospect, oversized for their immediate context. Water systems in certain cities were built with distribution capacity far exceeding the municipal population at the time of construction. Road networks in newly settled regions were engineered to widths and load tolerances that would not be operationally necessary for a generation. Civic buildings in towns that were, at the time of construction, home to only a few thousand people were built with the material weight and architectural permanence of capital cities. Each of these, individually, can be explained by the same forward planning argument applied to the stations. And individually, that argument is plausible. The question that begins to surface, slowly without urgency but persistently, is whether the forward planning explanation was arrived at through the documentation, or whether the documentation was interpreted through a framework that assumed forward planning must be the answer. These are different things. One is evidence-first reasoning. The other is conclusion-first interpretation. Which one is operating in any given case requires looking at the actual records with some care. The stations of the early rail era were built in a world that was, officially, just beginning to understand what rail travel would become. The engineers who designed them, the investors who funded them, the civic authorities who approved them, were working, by almost every account, at the frontier of a new technology with no reliable model for where it would lead. And yet the infrastructure they produced, in its scale, in its permanence, in its apparent calibration to a future that had not yet arrived, sometimes looks less like an experiment than like a response. A response to what, exactly, is a question the physical record raises without answering. The stations of continental Europe are easy to examine in isolation. Their age is legible in the stone. Their scale is visible from the street. But isolation is precisely the wrong method for this kind of investigation. A single oversized building in a single city in a single decade is an architectural curiosity. The same pattern, appearing across different countries, different railway companies, different regulatory environments, and different decades, that is something the methodology of isolation was never designed to handle. So let the pattern expand. Move west. Move to Britain, where the railway was not imported from elsewhere but invented, iterated, and exported. The birthplace of the technology. The place where, if anywhere, the scale of early infrastructure should reflect the actual primitive state of the art, because there was no prior model to imitate, no foreign example to copy ambitiously. British railway builders were working from nothing. And yet, the same phenomenon appears. The great terminal stations of Britain's early rail era were not built to the scale of 1840s ridership. They were built to a scale that took decades to fill. Brunel's work at Paddington, even in its original form before the expansions that came later, reflected a spatial logic that its first passengers did not require. The width of the train shed, the length of the platforms, the design of the approach. These were not features calibrated to the passenger volumes of the 1840s. They were calibrated, it appears, to something larger, something anticipated, or perhaps something else. The standard explanation applied consistently: Brunel was a visionary. He built for the future. That interpretation is reasonable. Brunel's documentation is comparatively rich. His ambition is well recorded. But the habit of applying the visionary explanation broadly, using well-documented cases as justification for applying the same label to less documented ones, is a methodological move that deserves to be noticed. Now cross the Atlantic. The American rail network developed under different conditions than its European counterpart. The distances were greater. The terrain was more variable. The financial structures were different, often speculative, land-grant driven, operating on timelines and risk tolerances unlike anything in Britain or continental Europe. And the cities being connected were, in many cases, not yet cities. They were towns. In some cases, they were little more than survey stakes in ambition. The stations built to serve these places, in the middle decades of the 19th century, before many of them had population bases that could justify modest infrastructure, let alone grand architecture, are among the more difficult cases to explain through forward planning alone. Consider the pattern that emerges across the American Midwest and Northeast. Station buildings of considerable permanence. Facades in stone and brick, when timber construction would have been faster, cheaper, and entirely adequate for the actual passenger volumes of the period. Interior volumes that feel, when examined against the documented ridership of their opening years, disproportionate in a specific way. Not randomly oversized. Oversized in the vertical. High ceilings. Large windows. Structural spans that required significant engineering investment to achieve and which provided, in practical terms for a small daily passenger count, almost no operational benefit. Why engineer a 40-foot ceiling for 200 daily passengers? The forward-planning answer: because the builder expected those 200 to become 20,000. Which, in some cases, they did. American rail ridership grew dramatically. Many of these stations did eventually fill. The foresight, again, appears accurate over the long term. But the foresight was not uniform in its documentation. Some stations were accompanied by letters, prospectus documents, investor presentations projecting ridership growth and justifying construction expenditure. Others were not. Others simply appeared, fully formed, scaled beyond their moment, serving a demand that would not arrive for a decade or more, with records that tell us the station was built but do not consistently explain why it was built at that particular scale. There is a specific sub-pattern within the American cases that is worth slowing down for. Infrastructure before settlement. This is not controversial as a historical observation. It is, in fact, the stated logic of several major American rail projects. Build the line and the population will follow. The railway as a tool of deliberate settlement rather than a response to existing demand. This is documented. It is policy, not anomaly. But the station infrastructure associated with these projects sometimes exceeds even that expansionist logic. A station built to serve a town that does not yet exist can be justified as promotional, aspirational, a signal to potential settlers that this place has a future. A station built at that scale, with that level of material investment, in that degree of permanence, when the railway company financing it was operating on speculative capital and had no guarantee the town would ever materialize, moves the conversation into a different register. Not conspiracy. Not suppression. A different register of historical question. What assumptions were these builders operating from? What did they expect to be true that justified committing that level of resource to infrastructure serving a population that, at the time of construction, did not exist? The British cases and the American cases share one quality that is easy to overlook when examining them individually. The overscale is not random. It is not the product of individual ego or isolated architectural ambition in each instance. It is consistent in type. The same features recur: platform length, ceiling height, facade permanence, structural overengineering relative to immediate functional need. Consistency of type across independent projects, independent architects, independent financial contexts, and independent geographies is unusual. When the same solution appears repeatedly in the absence of a documented shared cause, the investigative methodology that applies is not to find the best individual explanation for each case. It is to ask whether the individual cases share an input that the documentation has not yet fully surfaced. That is not a conclusion. That is the shape of an open question. And the open question has a specific pressure to it. Because the consistency is not approximate. It is not roughly similar across cases. The features that recur, the scale excesses, the platform dimensions, the structural permanence, recur at a level of precision that random independent ambition would not reliably produce. Some researchers, examining this consistency across cases, have begun to group these patterns under a broader interpretive label. Not as an answer. As a frame for holding the question while the examination continues. That label and what it does and does not claim, is where the pattern leads next. Labels are not explanations. This is worth stating clearly before introducing one, because the label that has attached itself to this pattern of anomalies carries considerable noise around it. Noise that tends to either inflate the claim far beyond what the evidence supports, or dismiss the underlying observations entirely because of the company they have been made to keep. Neither response is rigorous. And rigor is the only tool that makes this kind of examination worth conducting. The label is Tartaria. In its most extreme online form, the Tartaria framework is presented as a suppressed civilization, a vast, technologically advanced empire that spanned Eurasia and was deliberately erased from official history. That version makes specific claims about hidden populations, coordinated erasure, and recovered technology. It is presented, in those versions, as settled alternative history, as exposure. That is not the version this examination has been building toward. And it is important to say so plainly, because conflating the serious observational questions raised in the preceding examination with the maximalist Tartaria claim would be an error in both directions. It would overstate what the physical evidence actually supports, and it would allow the noise around the label to close down questions that the evidence genuinely keeps open. What the label Tartaria represents, in its more careful application, is an interpretive frame. a holding structure for a set of recurring observations that mainstream historical explanation has addressed inconsistently. Some researchers use it precisely this way, not as a claim about a lost civilization, but as shorthand for a cluster of architectural and infrastructural anomalies that share enough common features to warrant grouped examination. That version of the label is more modest, and more honest about what it is. Within that more modest application, the Tartaria framed as something specific for the train station pattern. It provides a vocabulary for discussing the possibility, not the certainty, the possibility, that some of the infrastructure attributed to 19th century construction may have had a more complex origin than the standard timeline assumes. This is one interpretation. There are several others, and they deserve equal representation. The first and most conventional interpretation has already been examined at length. Visionary planning, speculative construction, infrastructure built ahead of demand by investors and engineers with genuine long-term confidence in rail technology. This explanation is well supported in documented cases. It remains the default interpretation of mainstream architectural history, and the documentary record in many instances supports it. A second interpretation focuses on institutional momentum. Large bureaucratic and financial structures, railway companies, civic governments, engineering firms, sometimes produce infrastructure that exceeds rational need not because of foresight but because of the internal logic of large organizations. Budgets, once allocated, expand to fill available scope. Engineers, given latitude, build to the limits of their ambition rather than to the minimum of functional requirement. This interpretation does not require unusual foresight or unusual origin. It requires only that large institutions behave as large institutions typically behave. A third interpretation, less commonly applied but present in some architectural history literature, considers the possibility of repurposed or adapted structures. Under this reading, some stations that appear to have been built in the mid-19th century may have incorporated, modified, or been constructed within pre-existing structures whose original purpose was different. The overscale, under this interpretation, is not a product of forward planning for rail travel specifically, it is a residue of a prior function. The rail use came later, fitting itself into a space that was not originally designed for it, and the historical record absorbed this adaptation into a continuous construction narrative. This interpretation does not require dramatic conclusions about what those prior structures were or who built them. It requires only that architectural reuse, which is extremely well documented across history in many other contexts, was more prevalent in the early rail era than is typically acknowledged in rail-specific historiography. Each of these interpretations is defensible. None of them is complete. And the Tartaria label, in its careful form, does not replace any of them. It sits alongside them as a reminder that the grouping of anomalies across geography and time may require an explanation that operates at a different level of scale than individual case studies can provide. What makes the train station pattern specifically interesting within this broader interpretive conversation is the precision of the anomalies. Infrastructure that is oversized by a small margin can be explained by almost any of the above interpretations with ease. Infrastructure that is oversized consistently, in a specific register, platform length, ceiling height, structural permanence, facade elaboration, across dozens of independent projects on 2 continents, points toward a shared input of some kind. What that input was is the unresolved center of the question. Some researchers suggest the shared input was a common design philosophy circulating through the engineering networks of the era, a set of standards, formally or informally established, that produced consistent scale across projects by convention rather than by specific local calculation. This is plausible. Professional networks in 19th century engineering were tighter than they might appear, and design conventions traveled quickly through them. Others suggest the consistency points toward a shared expectation about what rail infrastructure would need to handle, an expectation that was not documented in surviving investor materials because it was assumed rather than argued. A baseline assumption about scale that everyone involved treated as obvious and therefore did not record. Both of these interpretations are less dramatic than the Tartaria claim in its maximal form. Both are also less satisfying because they explain the consistency without explaining where the shared standard or the shared assumption came from. The physical record, taken on its own terms, presents a specific profile. Stations built at the dawn of rail travel that were scaled for a demand that would not arrive for decades. The same scale excess appearing across independent projects in Britain, continental Europe, and the United States. A documentary record that supports the forward planning narrative robustly in some cases and thinly in others. And a consistency of type, the specific features that recur, that is difficult to attribute to independent ambition alone. What the physical record does not present is a conclusion. It presents a pattern. Patterns invite interpretation. Interpretation requires acknowledging the limits of what the evidence can and cannot support. The Tartaria label, in its careful form, is one way of marking the location of those limits, of saying, here is a cluster of observations that existing frameworks have not fully absorbed, and the incompleteness deserves to be named rather than papered over. Whether the incompleteness reflects gaps in surviving documentation, limitations in current methodology, or something more structurally unusual about the origins of this infrastructure is a question the record leaves open. The stations are still standing. Their dimensions have not changed. The ridership figures for their opening decades are documented. The gap between those two things remains exactly as wide as it has always been. And the explanation that would close that gap, fully, cleanly, without remainder, has not yet been written.